It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Charles Basch, and again, I interviewed him before the session today, and he said he's most proud of his 6 kids. One of his daughters has snowboarded in the X Games. Dr. Basch was raised in the Bronx, but loves the outdoors. He actually hitchhiked across the country at 17 years old. I would not recommend that now, young people, if you're in here. Don't do that. Not wise. That was a while ago. It was a little safer. And I asked him, why the outdoors? If you grew up in the Bronx, I've spent quite a bit of time in the Bronx. And he said maybe because his father's family were loggers and hungry, or maybe because his mother's family lived on a farm where they visited regularly as a child. He loves the contrast between the city and the country. So Dr. Basch's keynote today is healthier kids learn better. I think we just heard that. The missing link in closing the achievement gap. Dr. Charles Basch.
Okay, good. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. I'm really honored to be here today. And I am going to talk about the relationships between health and learning. Most of you folks here seem like you're health-oriented people like myself, and we've been advocating for greater emphasis on health in the schools for a really long time. And you know, there's been pockets of interest from one school to another, but you can't help but feel when you look at the schools all over the country, health has not been really fully embraced by the educators and the education community. And you can see that in things like, for example, maybe in the state of Washington, the ratio of students to nurses is like 2,000 to 1. You can see it in the United States Department of Education and the emphasis or lack of emphasis that they place on health. And it's kind of understandable in some respects. I mean, schools are really struggling to achieve the educational mission. And they've been trying to implement different strategies to improve education and make America more competitive globally. Because America's really fallen behind in the way our educational system has really prepared students to compete in a 21st century global economy, which is really different than it was in the past. So they've tried to improve the effectiveness of teachers, and they've tried to revise the curriculum to make it more aligned with core standards. And you know, there's been development of different organizational structures like charter schools and different financing strategies to improve things, and collecting different data to try to inform how to track students and educate students better. But one of the things that's become increasingly clear is that no matter how effectively teachers can teach, how rigorous the curricula are, how we reorganize schools, how we collect data, all of these different efforts are really going to be jeopardized if students aren't motivated and able to learn. And these factors that I've called educationally relevant health disparities have like a powerful, but in the education world, largely overlooked effect on motivation and ability to learn. So I'm honored to share the stage with Maxine. She's kind of made this point here. This is a very simple image up on the screen, but I think it's an incredibly important and powerful concept. And that is that there's these strong, strong connections between our health and our education. And these go both ways. As Maxine says, not controversial. People with higher levels of education are healthier. They live longer. They have greater income, which gives greater access to healthcare system, better access to food, housing, and things that have a strong effect on our health. What's become increasingly clear is that health factors, certain health factors in particular, also have real powerful effects on teaching and learning and on educational attainment. And this is becoming increasingly recognized, and that's kind of what I'm going to focus on. Now, when you look at the youth, or for that matter, adults in the United States, and you see the populations that have the greatest health disparities, and you see the populations that have the greatest educational disparities, they are the same exact population. And this population tends to be those that have the lowest levels of income and the most challenging social economic conditions with respect to housing and other things like that. So we have these problems that are related, but the solutions up till now have been quite separate. And that's starting to change, and that's a good thing. So I'm going to focus on urban minority youth. That's kind of the way that my research was done, but it's not to say there's not tremendous needs in rural America. We know teen pregnancy rates are actually the highest in rural counties. I'm going to focus on school-age population. Another thing that's become clear is the preschool population, that is children aged 0 to 5, even probably higher priority, because that's when their brains are developing and can have a tremendous effect on the rest of their lives. But I'm focusing on school-age populations. Unfortunately, in the United States, we don't really have a great infrastructure for preschool education. I hope that changes. And I'm going to only focus on health problems that can be feasibly and effectively addressed in the schools. And my talk's kind of divided into two parts. First, I'll talk about the health problems that affect learning, and then what can we do about it through the schools. So schools can't do everything. They can't address all the different health problems affecting young people. There has to be some way to prioritize what should be done. So I came up with certain criteria. One was the extent, how prevalent are the problems, and are there great disparities? One is, what's the evidence that certain health problems really have causal effects on education? And then, can these problems be addressed through the schools? And based on those three criteria, I came up with a list of 7 health problems that at least warrant consideration by people in schools, and they're vision, asthma, teen pregnancy, aggression and violence, physical activity, breakfast, and ADHD. So I just want to say a word about these things before I continue on. Now, these are based on kind of like national data, but things are different from one place to another. That's not to say that every school system should focus on these 7 things. And it's not to say that there aren't other health problems like tobacco, alcohol, or drug use, or other things that warrant being a priority in a school. These are just used as an illustration to demonstrate how important health problems are in affecting teaching and learning. And then just one last thing I want to say that's not on this list, but it's kind of a key issue, underlying issue, and that is mental and emotional health. So mental and emotional health is not directly delineated in this list, because if you look in the literature, you don't see research on mental emotional health. You see research on depression and anxiety and different issues, but mental and emotional health is either a cause of or a result of every one of these things. And it's really, in my opinion, kind of an underlying theme of any effective school health program. And I know there's some school nurses in the room, and if you talk with them, they'll tell you that probably mental and emotional health is the most common issue that children and adolescents will come in and see them. So all of these problems are highly prevalent in the United States. Vision problems are presumed to affect about 1 in 5 young children. Asthma is the most common chronic disease in the United States. It's about 9.9 million youth. That's 14% of youth under the age of 18. In some school districts, those rates are much higher. About 1 in 3 female teens is expected to become pregnant before age 20. That's kind of a staggering statistic that most people can't even believe when they hear it, but it's a true statement, and it's been like that for many, many years. Violence is pervasive in our society. You see it in movies, you see it in music, you see it on the streets, and you see it in our schools. About 2 out of 3 youth don't get enough physical activity. 1 in 5 skip breakfast on any given day. And ADHD, inattention and hyperactivity, is the most common mental and behavioral problem affecting young people. And that's about 8% of youth in the schools. That's about over 4.5 million children, and many more are below the diagnostic threshold, but nonetheless are affected by issues of inattention and hyperactivity. It's hard to learn to pay attention. You know, having 6 children, I know, you know, teaching a child to pay attention is a real skill, and it's a hard skill to learn. Now, as prevalent as all these problems are, all these problems disproportionately affect urban minority youth, and they disproportionately affect youth living in poverty. You see that with vision. You see it with asthma, for example, compared with whites. Prevalence rates for asthma for black youth are about 45% higher. You see the importance of disaggregating the Hispanic population. It depends on the cultural heritage. We don't know what the cause of asthma is. It's thought to be caused by interactions between genes and the environment. And the issue is not so much asthma. Asthma can be controlled. The issue is poorly controlled asthma. And you see these same exact disparities if you look at poorly controlled asthma by things like overuse of emergency rooms and underuse of efficacious medications. Like, asthma can be treated highly effectively, but many young children with asthma just don't get the care they need. And that's really a shame and has to change. These are data on birth rates we see compared with whites. The birth rates for blacks are about 3 times as high. For Hispanic female teens, 4 times as high. That's based on 2006 data. This is physical fighting in school. About 35% of high school students report being in a physical fight in school in the past year. This is high school students nationwide. And you see these same disparities. Now, this next slide is an important one. You see, for Hispanic high school students, about 1 in 10 say they have missed 1 or more days of school in the past month because they were afraid to be at school or afraid to travel to or from school. That's 1 or more days of absence in the past month because they're afraid to be at school. So I'm going to come back and talk about that. And then here we see about 2 out of 3 female high school students get enough physical activity on any given day, on any given week, and large disparities in breakfast consumption between black and white youth that persist from age 9 to 19. And ADHD is much more common in single mother head of households and those with lower compared to upper income. So everything I've talked about up till now, sadly, is kind of old news. We've been really good at documenting all these problems. These problems have existed, these disparities have existed for decades of time. But the next topic I'm going to talk about is largely based on new research conducted mainly in the last 10 years. And it's mainly been conducted by people who are neuroscientists and molecular biologists. And that is, how and why do these health problems affect teaching and learning? How and why do these health problems affect educational outcomes? And there's at least 5 different specific ways that that happens. And those are sensory perceptions, cognition, connectedness and engagement with school, absenteeism, and dropout. So sensory perception is just being able to see well and hear well. Tremendous amount of learning occurs through our visual systems. Cognition is things like paying attention, being able to remember things. By the way, I don't know if you have a site to post these slides. I see some people trying to take notes, but all of you can have copies of these slides and take them and use them. Please do. That would be great. And also, we can make available the report upon which all of these are based. So that would be great. Don't feel a need to try to write everything down because I'm obviously going through a lot of stuff. Cognition is just memory, thinking skills. Absenteeism is kind of obviously an important thing. Educators know that. In fact, we can predict with good certainty whether or not a young person is going to graduate from high school by looking at their attendance rate in 4th grade. So we know education is important, and obviously if you drop out of school, you lose those opportunities for teaching and learning. One of the things that's been less appreciated, or at least well documented, is the importance of number 3 up there, this thing called school connectedness. And that means the extent to which students in the school feel like the teachers in the school and their peers in the school care about them. Care about them as people, care about them as learners. Is it a place where they want to be? Is it a place where they feel like they belong? Or is it a place where they want to get away from? And what's been shown is that the students who feel a strong sense of school connectedness do much better academically as well as socially. So how and why do these problems affect education? Well, here, with respect to sensory perceptions, vision is really an important issue. It turns out that about 1 in 5 kindergartners have visual problems. Now, in some cases, those are serious visual problems like amblyopia or strabismus, but in many of those cases, probably about 90% of those cases, it's just refractive error. It's just hyperopia. I have hyperopia. Many of you have hyperopia. If you don't yet, you will as you get older. And what you're going to find is, if you can't see print material when you're looking at it close up, it makes it harder, much, much harder to learn. Because imagine, first of all, when you're in kindergarten, 1st grade, learning how to read is a hard skill on its own. English is a very quirky language, and you're trying to make distinctions between P's and D's and B's and Q's. Now all of a sudden, imagine it's all blurry. It's not going to help. So vision is a critically important thing. Children with HD not only have more problems with vision, they have problems with perception of time. And perception of time is important in carrying out sequenced activities, for example, like an algebra problem or like writing a story that to you or I might seem relatively straightforward, like, okay, the story has to have 3 parts, first, then, finally, which might seem easy, but if you're having perception problems, it's hard to keep that straight. Now, this next topic on cognition, thinking skills, executive functioning, making decisions, solving problems. One of the things that's really important to notice here is that these pathways, these causal pathways, are affected by many different problems. So here, how do vision problems affect cognition? Well, here we're not talking about like sensory perception, we're talking about visual motor coordination. We're talking about the connections between your eyes and your brain. And that's, for example, being able to see something on the blackboard and then write it down in your notes. And it turns out note-taking is really an important skill. And if you have these visual motor integration problems, as many children do, and it seems to be associated with premature birth, that's going to cause problem. How does asthma affect cognition? The way asthma affects cognition, and it's not asthma, it's poorly controlled asthma, is because children with poorly controlled asthma have disrupted sleep. And that's one of the things that's been recognized, again, just in the last 10 years or so, is that sleep is a really important factor that affects our brains. It affects our ability to concentrate and pay attention. As Aaron said, I have 6 children, so I do know a little about sleep deprivation. And you see that when you don't sleep as well, when you have a harder time falling asleep, when you have a harder time staying asleep, it's much harder to really pay attention and focus. If children go to a school characterized with a lot of attention and violence, they're much more likely to have intrusive thoughts. They're much more likely to be distracted. You know, if you're in an algebra class and you're worried about whether or not you're going to get beat up after school or going to be harassed in the staircase when the bell rings, when you're changing from one classroom to another, it's much harder to focus your attention and pay attention. Now, about 4,000 years ago, the Greeks knew that physical activity was important for our brains, and they recognized the connections between our bodies and our minds. But it's really only about the last 10 years or so that neuroscientists have really shown exactly how and why physical activity influences our thinking. And they've shown it through its effects on brain chemistry and the uptake of neuronal factors and oxygen saturation. And they've really demonstrated that physical activity, children who are more physical activity, have brain chemistry that's different. You can see it through neuroimaging studies and things like that. It's helpful. It helps you pay attention, helps you remember things and do better. Well, we all know breakfast is important. How do we know breakfast is important? Well, don't your school principals always send home a note on the day before the test to the parents to say, make sure your child gets a good night's sleep and eat a good breakfast? Do that, don't you? It's probably a good idea those other 179 days of the school year, too. So, again, we know that breakfast, eating good breakfast is important. And by definition, children with inattention and hyperactivity problems can't focus attention. They can't remember things. They can't comprehend as well. They can't draw causal inferences from the things they read. Now here, school connectedness, the extent to which young people feel that others in the school care about them as people and as learners. So now imagine the child with vision problems. How does that affect their school connectedness? Well, no matter how hard they try, they're having trouble succeeding. They keep failing. If they don't get glasses, they can't see well. So the result is they're going to become demoralized, like anyone would. It's reasonable to expect. You keep trying and you keep failing, it's not going to be a fun experience. You're going to disengage from school. If you're children with poorly controlled asthma, they tend to be more anxious at school. Having an asthma exacerbation is an incredibly scary experience. If you've ever been underwater or gasping for breath, you have a sense for how scary that could be. If you're worried about that happening in school and not sure if somebody's going to know how to help you or know what to do, it's reasonable that you have a lot more anxiety. If you go to a school where there's a lot of aggression and violence, and it's not just physical aggression and violence, some of the most insidious and hurtful aggression is through verbal aggression, through the things that people say to one another. And now, more than ever before, just the cyber aggression is probably among the most intense and the most hurtful aggression that occurs through social media. That's not going to be a place where there's going to be a sense of school connectedness and belonging. Now, I know there's some physical educators in here, and physical education programs provide an amazing opportunity to foster school connectedness. Unfortunately, many school leaders are making misguided judgments to cut back on physical education programs based on the misconception that doing that is going to improve their students' test performance. And there's no evidence to support that, and all the available evidence suggests that's not the case. But physical education programs can help people to learn together to work as teams. They can help young people learn how to fail and persevere. They can help young people learn how to get along and solve problems together. And these skills, like working together as a team, persevering, it turns out if you read Tony Wagner's book on making innovation, these are the skills that tend to be really important, as well as learning content. And physical education programs have a tremendous opportunity to contribute to them. And then one of the saddest things I learned in reading the hundreds of papers I did to prepare the little report I did was that children with ADHD don't have any friends. They don't get along with adults. They don't get along with the other kids. And most of the treatments help control their symptoms, but they don't really help them improve their social skills to get along better. It's not controversial that children with asthma are absent from school more. I recently looked at data in the 58 lowest performing schools in New York City. In New York City, there's 1.1 million children in the public schools. We looked at data from the 58 lowest performing elementary schools, and we found that children with asthma compared to children without asthma were absent 7 times as many days. That was on average 14 days a year compared to 2. The slide in the first part of the talk talked about how a significant portion of high school students in America don't go to school because they're afraid to travel to or from school. If you're in a school characterized by a lot of fighting, a lot of aggression, it's not going to be someplace you're going to want to be. Much more absenteeism in those situations. And then physical activity and breakfast are shown to improve attendance on a regular basis, and children with ADHD are absent much more frequently. And we know that teen pregnancy is a major cause of dropout. That's even after controlling for all the social and economic predisposing factors, and children with ADHD drop out of school on a much higher basis. So what can schools do? What's reasonable to expect? Time is a precious commodity in schools. What can they do? Well, I'll just go down a quick list to give some examples. Vision screening in elementary schools is pervasive in the United States. About 90% of schools do this, but unfortunately, typically what happens is when a child fails a vision screen, a note gets sent home to parents. And, in some cases, the parent may not take the child for an eye exam because it seems like the child can see fine. So what we found is, it's kind of a reasonable investment to just provide on-site exams by an optometrist in the school for every child that fails a vision screening. And then give them 2 pair of glasses, because children are children. They're going to lose or break glasses. The glasses, we did this in New York City. In a variety of elementary schools, and we found it doubled the rate of in-class use of eyeglasses. And relatively low cost. The glasses cost about $12 per pair. With respect to asthma, if you go to the CDC website, you can see the asthma-friendly schools guidelines and how to, basically you want to manage the cases of children with asthma and particularly monitor their absenteeism. You want to eliminate some of the environmental triggers, which can be anything from, the solvents used for cleaning things to idling of buses in the, parking lot. Educating students how to deal with their own asthma and providing safe opportunities. Teen pregnancy can be prevented, no question about that, but if you start trying to do that in high school or junior high school, that's not going to work. The time to prevent teen pregnancy is in kindergarten, and that doesn't mean, oh, thank you. And it doesn't mean you're talking about sexual behaviors in kindergarten, obviously. The way one of my favorite people, Mike Carrera, talks about above the neck sex education. Sex education and teen pregnancy prevention is about decision-making skills. It's about social emotional skills. It's about helping young people have aspirations and recognize what it's going to mean to have a child as a teenager. It's incredibly hard as an older person having a young child. It's an incredible commitment to raise young children, and it's never-ending commitment for the rest of your life, and it's important to help young people learn that one of the surest ways to end up with a life of poverty is having a non-marital teen birth. Now, if you look at aggression and violence here too, it's not controversial that we know that there are programs that are available to deal with these problems. We know that there are programs that reduce violence in schools. And you see the same kind of issues: effective skills-based health education, social emotional learning. So it's not reasonable to expect that there's going to be a separate curriculum for every different health topic. But instead, what we've come to appreciate is just the importance of certain social and emotional skills and social emotional development and learning as part of a reasonable expectation for schools. Providing a safe and physical environment and a supportive social climate is kind of essential if we can expect children to learn. And then there are certain children who are going to need counseling and psychological and social services. I mean, I know young people who, when they were 5 and 6 and 7 years old, you know, were exposed to extreme trauma, possibly in their family situation, possibly in their community situation. I'm talking about seeing people murdered and bleed to death in the street when they're, you know, young children. And that's not something you're going to forget. For physical education programs, there are standards-based programs, recess and in-class movement programs, intramural and after-school programs, support for walking and biking to school. And again, I would see this beyond you know, the kinds of programs that focus on the most athletic children. As Maxine mentioned, you move the budgets and the emphasis away from the, you know, the 80 students. They're the best athletes. They don't really need the programs. It's the other, you know, 2020 students that need those programs. So, you know, just looking at alternative programs, a lot of times if you're not physically capable, if you're not athletic, you get cut from those programs. You miss opportunities to participate in those programs. And that's, you know, hopefully what can begin to be changed, and providing other opportunities, whether it's jumping rope or dancing or martial arts or any other number of opportunities to help cultivate like a lifelong love for physical activity. And breakfast in the classroom, what's been shown, I forgot the percentage that you said Washington was. I know a recent study done by the AFHK showed that of the 26 major urban areas in the United States, New York City was the lowest in the rate of breakfast consumption. You're in the 39th for the state. So New York City is the lowest of any major city in the country. And what's been shown over and over and over from one place to another is allowing students to eat breakfast in the classroom boosts the rates of participation in school breakfast program. And, you know, states lose hundreds of millions of dollars. They lose millions of dollars by not getting these breakfasts reimbursed. So that's something to consider. And these are just throwing out ideas of things to consider. And with respect to inattention and hyperactivity, it's amazing how little attention has been given to this topic because it's such an important health problem. But there are different kinds of interventions. For example, if you look at Greg Fabiano, he talks about the daily report cards, and in different places just recognizing that if a child has inattention problems, you don't want that child sitting in the back of the room. You want that child sitting as close to the teacher as possible, and recognizing that, you know, beyond controlling symptoms, these children need to have help in developing academic and social skills. And it's tragic because so many of the children with inattention and hyperactivity symptoms have incredible abilities, and their potential is too often lost because they don't get the help they need. So, you know, if a child can't see well, it's not realistic to expect that they're going to be able to learn to read as easily. And if you can't get a good night's sleep and you wake up in the night and you come to school tired and maybe haven't eaten breakfast, is it reasonable to expect you're going to be able to pay attention and learn as well? If you become pregnant and have a child when you're 16 or 17 years of age, that's going to make it much harder to complete high school. We know that. It's going to be much harder to fulfill your potential as a person. If you go to a school that's characterized by aggression and violence, where people are saying nasty things to you, where they may be, you know, bullying you, or and most of the time this is not occurring in a place where the adults are around. You're not going to see that. It's going to occur in the stairways. It's going to occur after school, walking to school. It's not going to be the kind of situation that you're going to want to feel connected to and really feel like you want to be part of. And if you come to school hungry, as millions of children do every single day, And for us, a long weekend might mean an extra day. For a young child, it might mean, another day being a little more hungry. It's going to make it much harder to learn. And if you can't pay attention, you can't learn. So now, one of the things that's been a little bit challenging is a lot of the different programs that are implemented in schools. The programs and the funding streams and the preparation for people, it's like all categorical. So we have our sex education programs, and we have our violence prevention programs, and we have our nutrition programs, and we have our physical education programs, and the funding for all these programs tends to be separated, and a lot of times even competing. These programs are competing with one another in the schools, and that's really counterproductive and hasn't worked for us, because what's really an important kind of take-home message is that these different health issues interact with one another. When I was recently interviewed by a reporter from a popular education magazine, and she asked me, well, what's the single most important thing we should do? And I think the single most important thing we should do is to recognize that there's no single most important thing we should do. These are complicated problems that are going to take solutions that involve multiple strategies, and there's a need to focus on that. So there's been more and more recognition among the education community about healthy kids learn better. It's funny, I've given this talk a lot around different parts of the country, and one of my favorite things that's happened in my experience of doing that is I had a grandmother who was probably about 80 years old come up to me afterwards, and she said, Chuck, that was really great, but doesn't everybody already know this? Because it's kind of common sense. The things is not, we have this, neurosciences research and all of that, but it's like common sense that people knew long time ago. But now we have people from, like, Secretary of Education Arne Duncan has spoken out about this, and Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, has spoken out about this, and Sandy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers Union, has spoken out about this, and Dennis Van Rokel, the president of the National Education Association, has spoken out about this, and you can kind of go down the list from the National PTA to the Chief State School Officers to all these different groups, but the bottom line is at this point, there's still more rhetoric than reality. And if you look at the way health programs are organized in the nation's schools, we find that most of them are not strategically planned. They too often use poor quality programs, and they're not effectively coordinated. So I'm going to just talk briefly about those three things, because I think those are the three things to keep in mind in trying to implement a program. So when I talk about strategic planning, what I'm talking about is schools can't do everything. You have to have priorities. And it doesn't mean the priorities have to be the same in every single school system. If you're in a rural area, it might be different priorities than if you're in an urban area. And if you have resources and lots of interest to do something among a champion in the school, then it might make more sense to focus on that than an area where there's little interest. But I think to the extent that we can make this strong connection between health problems that are going to affect teaching and learning, we will be much more likely to be embraced as a fundamental part of the mission of schools. Because that's really what we're working toward, is to try to have school health programs more fully embraced as part of the fundamental mission. Now, probably most of us sitting here in this room believe that health should be part of the fundamental mission of schools, because schools should be helping young people to develop as healthy people. And I'm one of those people. I believe that. But educators throughout America, have not fully embraced it as part of the fundamental mission. They're trying to focus on literacy and numeracy and struggling to achieve that. So if we can make that connection, I think it's more likely to be really embraced. And now, it's really sad that we have all these high-quality programs. Here's some examples from the CDC website about, smoking programs, smoking prevention programs, or injury prevention programs. And we have standards-based physical activity programs and national health education standards. And we have, different tools like the Health Education Curriculum Analysis Tool and the School Health Index and Physical Education Curriculum Analysis Tool. And there's different registries of evidence-based programs. This is one by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. You could go to the U.S. Department of Education What Works Clearinghouse, and they'll show you programs that have some evidence of effectiveness. But if you look at some of the most widely implemented school health programs in the United States, and that could be with respect to substance abuse, that could be with respect to sex education programs, these are programs that have had no evidence of effectiveness. That's a problem. That's a learning experience for us because it's telling us that school leaders and people in schools are making decisions about which programs to use that is not based on facts. So, Colleen told me I have 5 minutes left. I have like another hour of material, but I'll start talking faster. So, now, this issue of effective coordination is really key because one of the things that we know is what does coordination means is different people playing different roles, but they're all working toward the same goal of helping students have better motivation and learn by improving their health. And to do that really requires a person to take responsibility for the coordination. And Tennessee is the only state in the United States where they've had a health coordinator assigned in every school district, and it's part of their funding in their state budget. The school health, other ideas for the school health council and involving community, we talked about the importance of linking community services, but think about, health department comes in and does the vision screening, sends a note home to parents to have an eye exam, but then the teacher has to make sure that the student wears the glasses in the classroom, parents have to make sure the child wears the glasses. It's easy to see how you can drop the ball easily for that. So coordination is about making sure that the programs get implemented, because a lot of programs don't work because they don't get implemented. And you can see this in every aspect of education. So this is kind of what we have now. We have our solutions where these health programs and education programs and social service programs are in silos. That doesn't work very well. It doesn't serve our youth very well. The coordinated school health program advocated by the CDC is an attempt to, pull that together and facilitate integration between the different programs. And I don't really have quite enough time to go through all the different strategies I was going to talk about, but can certainly talk about those maybe later in the day in some of the breakout sessions. But I just want to say, if we talk about highly effective, these are some of the priorities of the U.S. Department of Education. Distribution of highly effective teachers. So what's a highly effective teacher mean? Is that somebody who knows how to manage conflict in the classroom? Is that somebody who knows how to recognize a student who has trouble seeing or having trouble paying attention, knows which child might need a referral for ADHD? Is that a teacher who knows how to help students develop and practice social emotional skills? Focus on the lowest performing schools. Well, guess what? Those lowest performing schools, there's about 5,000 of them in the United States. Those are the same exact schools that have the greatest health disparities. It's the same population that we're talking about. And then improving data systems. We don't collect any data on school connectedness. We don't collect any data on school climate. We don't collect any data to know why students are absent, in which even though you may have super high rates of overall attendance, like 90% in elementary schools, you still have high rates of chronic absenteeism, a small portion of students. And that's important to track and do something about. anyway, I'm going to try to wrap it up in the next minute or two. So I've called for, the development of a national school health strategic plan to integrate different health measures into our data systems and integrate health into the ed research agenda. Because I'm running out of time, I just want to say, one of the most important things that you could consider doing in your school, and this has been done in Chicago and some other places, is including health goals in the mandated school improvement plans. If you don't measure it, it's not important. If there's no accountability, you're going to move on to the things that you're going to be accountable for. Somebody say, hey, did you get this done? What's the status of this? So that's a really important thing that can be done. And there's a need for help. Schools can't do this alone. Unfortunately, schools didn't really get much, school people didn't really get much help in learning how to do any of these things. Now, I'm a researcher. I'm a researcher at Columbia University. I've gotten tens of millions of dollars in doing research, but we don't need more research. We don't need to know what to do. What we need now is research to figure out how to do what we already know. We've learned these things, and now we need to put them into practice. And, colleges of education. Now, I've been in a college of education for 30 years. I came there because I thought, oh, this is the place to be. And I can tell you, I've had a greater struggle there than in almost every other audience that I've ever worked with. But, it's not surprising that school principals and superintendents are not fully embracing this material. They learn anything about it in their professional preparation programs. The pre-service teachers learn about this in their professional preparation programs. They want to learn about it because they know it's important, but most colleges of education in the United States are really not doing an adequate job to prepare the next generation of teachers. And I hope, I'm working with a bunch of people to try to change that, and it's a struggle. But the times are changing. It's a good time. Many of us have been working this field for many, many years, and it's been kind of like pushing a snowball uphill is the analogy I've heard before, but it's a good time. You can kind of feel right now people are starting to get it. More and more people are starting to get it. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's always a pleasure for me to speak with people who can actually put these ideas into practice, and I appreciate that. Help in any way I can. Thank you.